Well, today marks the first in a Bible study series on the character of Joseph. And when I say Joseph, I don't mean the father of our Lord Jesus. I'm talking about Joseph, the 11th son of the great patriarch Jacob, whose story is told in the last few chapters of the book of Genesis. The story of Joseph is a story, at least in part, about family dysfunction. It's a story about a young man who is betrayed by the people he loves and trusts the most. It's the story about a man who falls into the depths of misery in life before eventually being raised up to the heights of glory. Most importantly, though, the story of Joseph is the story about how God can take even the worst messes that we as human beings make and work through those messes to bring about his own plan of salvation and healing and redemption. So today we start by taking a closer look at Genesis 37 verses 1 to 11, and here we're introduced to the character of Joseph as a young man. Now, he is a bit of an arrogant young man, but you can tell that he is a young man of special vision and wisdom and intelligence. So I do hope you're blessed by this Bible study. If you are, I do encourage you to leave a like. And if you'd like more from Stone Church, more sermons, more Bible studies, and more services, please do subscribe. So with that out of the way, let's get started.
This is definitely a family drama, as you may have gathered so far just from that reading. And the family that we're talking about specifically is the family of the great Jewish patriarch Jacob. Hey, Russ, good to see you. And you know who Jacob is. Jacob is the son of Isaac, and he's the grandson of Abraham. And Abraham, of course, is the one to whom God says, go from your country, your kindred, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And that land, of course, is the land of Canaan. It would eventually become the land of Abraham's descendants, the Jews. And Abraham and Sarah, as you know, were obedient to this call of God, and eventually they go off to the land of Canaan. And despite their old age, despite their infertility, they managed to have a son. What was the name of the first son they had? You remember? It was Isaac, right? So they have a son, Isaac. Isaac, in turn, has two sons, Jacob and Esau. They're twins. And Jacob and Esau, unfortunately, don't get along very well. In fact, for reasons that I won't get into today, like this feud between the brothers becomes so bad, becomes so toxic, that eventually Esau says, I'm going to murder Jacob. I hate him that much. So, of course, Jacob gets wind of this plot on his life, and he decides to run away from home, and he goes all the way back to the land of Mesopotamia. So he goes to Mesopotamia, and eventually, so many years later, Jacob does come back home to Canaan from Mesopotamia. But when he returns, Jacob, and he's now known as Israel, when Jacob comes back home, he's wiser, he's older, he's considerably more wealthy, he's got flocks, he's got herds, and most importantly of all, Jacob is a family man now. So he's got two wives. His two wives are Leah and Rachel, and plus two maidservants of Leah and Rachel, Bilhah and Zilpah. So between those four women, Jacob fathers 12 sons and one daughter. Now, there's something that you need to know about Jacob and his relationship with his two wives, and it's actually really important to understanding Joseph and the role that he plays in his family, in this very big, dysfunctional family, right? Jacob had a favorite wife, and his favorite wife was Rachel. Now, for the longest time, Rachel wasn't able to get pregnant. She couldn't have any kids. And for this reason, most of Jacob's kids came from the womb of the other women, from Leah and Bilhah and Zilpah. But eventually, Rachel does get pregnant, and when she does, she gives birth to Joseph. And eventually, she gives birth to another boy named Benjamin, and she dies in childbirth, I believe, when she gives birth to Benjamin. But anyway, Joseph is the firstborn of that favorite wife of Jacob. So there's something interesting about Joseph, and I want to get this straight. In one sense, Joseph is the least of his brothers. Why is that? Because he's the youngest in the family. Actually, Benjamin is strictly speaking the youngest, but Joseph is definitely on the bottom of the hierarchy in terms of birth order. He's really close to the bottom. And so in ancient Near Eastern culture, that meant that he was at the bottom of the pecking order. He's very much the least of among his brothers. However, even though Joseph is in one sense the last, he's also in another sense the first, because he happens to be the first son of Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel. So for this reason, again, Jacob has this really special love for Joseph, and he really dotes on him. So let that stick in your head, because I think it's really important. Joseph is last and first. And so in that sense, when a lot of people read this story, they see Jesus reflected in that. They see a type of Jesus, for Jesus. Jesus is last. Why? Because he's born to a poor Jewish peasant woman in some obscure corner of the Roman Empire. Jesus is last because he grows up in poverty. Jesus is last because he lives his life as a servant, and then he finally dies on the cross as a condemned political criminal. So that places him at the bottom of the hierarchy as far as I'm concerned, the bottom of the social hierarchy. But Jesus is also the eternal Word of God through whom all things were made. He's the resurrected Lord. He is the one who reigns forever at the right hand of God the Father. There's this quote, you probably recognize it from the book of Revelation. He is the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. So I think in that respect, there's some interesting parallels there again with Joseph. Again, Joseph is first and last. He's last because he's so young, last because he is low down there in birth order, but he's also first because he's so favored. And he's so favored by his father that his father gives him a special gift. So I'm going to read to you now Genesis 37, 3-4. Marty just read it earlier. And it said, now Israel, so Israel again is the other name of Jacob, Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his children because he was the son of his old age. And he had made him a long robe with sleeves. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. So the father demonstrates again this special love for Joseph by giving him a token or symbol of that favor, which is a full-length, long-sleeved robe. It wasn't necessarily many-colored. I know that some English translations of whatever Hebrew word is used there suggests that it was a multicolored coat. Of course, we're all familiar with Joseph and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. It wasn't necessarily, but it definitely was like a long-sleeved ornamental robe. It was fancy dress. It was dress wear. So note that Jacob didn't give his son a gift that he could stow away in a chest somewhere, right? He didn't give him a gift that could be discreetly displayed on his body, like a bracelet or a ring or a necklace. He gives him a coat. And it's a coat that he wore evidently all the time. And it was this constant visible reminder to his brothers that Jacob loved him more than anybody else. And so I think you know what the result of that would be, right? It's resentment from the older siblings. The older siblings are so very jealous of him. So I think the wonderful thing about this story is that we all come from families, and all families, even the most healthy of families, can be weird in this way, especially when it comes to birth order and who's the favorite and that sort of thing, right? And I think we can identify immediately with this story when we think to our own families. And the brothers also resent Joseph because of his dreams, too. So you could imagine one morning they're all sitting around at the breakfast table and they're eating their Cheerios, and all of a sudden Joseph comes downstairs and this is what he says. Listen to this dream that I dreamt. There we were binding sheaves in the field, and suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright. Then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more because of his dreams and his words. I think it's quite telling that Joseph actually tells his brothers he had the dream. Like, he could have just kept it to himself. He could have just remained silent about it and tucked it away in his own memory, but he makes it a point to tell his brothers. Could you guess why? Like, why do you think he did that? I think you're both right, basically. I think in ancient Near Eastern culture, and a lot of cultures today too, dreams have enormous significance, right? So if you have a vivid dream, it's only natural that you would tell family members and friends and say, look, what could this possibly mean, right? And because I teach English as a second language, I've met people from Middle Eastern cultures, and they're very serious about dreams to this day, which is wonderful. But also, I think Joseph is, whether he maybe has, on a subconscious level at least, he's boasting, right? So we'll take a look at his dream then. So in Joseph's dream, he's in the field with his brothers. It's around the time of harvest. They're binding wheat into bundles or sheaves, and his sheaf stands upright while the sheaves of his brothers bow down to honor it. And I think to the brothers, of course, the implication of this dream is pretty obvious. Basically, it's like Joseph is one day going to rule over us. We're going to have to bow down to him one day. And they're really angered by that idea. And I think one of the reasons why they're angered, it's not just jealousy. I think they see the dream as a disruption of the natural order of things. Because in the natural order of things, especially then, it's the eldest sons that had the priority. They were the ones who ruled, as it were, and the younger siblings bowed down to the oldest ones. Joseph's dream is definitely a threat to that. And so the brothers get angry. It's interesting, as I was reading this story, I think it echoed a story from the New Testament.
Prodigal son.
Interesting. That's not the one I thought of, though.
Oh,
I'm going to have to
that's
ask.
the one I thought of.
I'm going to ask you why you thought that in a second, but I'm thinking of when James and John, the two disciples of Jesus, go up to him and say, "Can we rule at your right and left hand side when you enter into the kingdom?" And Jesus gives a response, but what's interesting is when the rest of the disciples, the other 10 disciples, find out about what James and John said, they get really angry. They're resentful of that. But then Jesus takes that anger and he uses it as an opportunity to teach them, to instruct them. So what Jesus says is, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and the great ones make their authority over them felt. But it shall not be so among you. Rather, whoever wishes to be great among you shall be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave. Just so the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom to many." Right? And it's interesting, Jesus says, I want to zero in on one phrase here. He says, "Whoever wishes to be great among you shall be your servant." And eventually, you'll see this when Joseph's dream starts to come true, right? One day he actually will be great among his brothers, and we'll talk about that when the time comes. But in order to be the greatest among his brothers, he first has to become a slave. And that's a big part of Joseph's story. It's about his, being sold into slavery in Egypt, and he becomes very, very low in that place. And eventually, because of that, he becomes great. Right? So it's that same kind of reversal that Jesus is talking about. The last shall become first and the first shall become last. But Joseph doesn't voluntarily accept his servitude. Jesus does. He willingly acts as servant. Joseph doesn't. It's actually forced upon him by his own pride and also by the resentment of his brothers. But at any rate, Joseph's dreams don't stop here. He had another dream and told it to his brothers, saying, "Look, I've had another dream." I'm sure the brothers were very excited at that point.
Oh, no.
"The sun, the moon, and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, 'What kind of dream is this that you have had? Shall we indeed come, I and your mother and your brothers, and bow down to the ground before you?' So his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Joseph's second dream, very similar to the first one, but the symbolism is different because they're celestial objects rather than sheaves. Plus, in this particular vision, Joseph's father and mother are symbolically depicted. So the 11 stars obviously represent the 11 brothers, so his 10 oldest brothers and his 1 youngest brother, Benjamin. They're all bowing down before him with the sun. The sun is the father, right? And the moon, which represents his mother. Now, this is the confusing thing, and I don't know the answer to this question, but which mother does the moon symbolize? Now, it could be Rachel, who's the mother of Joseph and Benjamin, but by this time in the story, Rachel is dead. Remember, she died in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin, right? But it could also be Leah, but remember that Jacob uses the words, your mother, and Leah is not Joseph's mother. But it could also be Rachel's handmaid, Bilhah, because after Rachel died, Bilhah would have served as a surrogate mother to Benjamin and Joseph. So it could be her too. That's a little bit ambiguous. But I don't think that's really important to the story. The point is Joseph's dreams anger not only the brothers, but this time it angers his dad too. Why? Because again, it further disrupts the order of things. In the natural order of things, the father is not supposed to bow down to the son, but the son to the father. The son has priority, okay? But here in this vision, Jacob bows down to Joseph along with all of the brothers. But I want you to notice what the narrator tells us. So it says in the story that as angry as Jacob may be, he, and I quote, kept the matter in mind. So it seems like all of the brothers just kind of dismiss the dream and they're like, this is another stupid dream by Joseph, right? But Jacob is thinking to himself, as angry as he is, look, there may be something to this. Because Jacob, you'll recall himself, is a dreamer. He recognizes the significance of visions. And he's thinking to himself, maybe this is not just Joseph being arrogant and prideful. Maybe there's something from the Lord here, and I don't want to close my mind to that possibility. So I'll stop there for now, but I do, and we could talk about the passage a bit, but I do want to leave you with like an important takeaway. This is, I think, the most important takeaway for me from this passage. So I want to get back to this idea that Joseph is like Christ. He is a type for Jesus. Well, how? Again, like Joseph, Jesus is meek and lowly. Like Joseph, Jesus becomes a slave. However, like Joseph, Jesus is the one to whom one day every knee must bend. Okay? However, not only do human beings bend the knee to Christ at the end of all creation, but so too does all of the cosmos bow the knee before Jesus, sun, moon, and stars. And for this reason, Jesus and the vision or dream of Christ's rule is a threat to people in power. I think there's a reason why throughout history and in various parts of the world, even today, the church is persecuted by those in power. Because if Jesus is Lord, Caesar is not. Right? If Jesus is Lord, then Caesar is not. And if you are the type of person, the dictator who covets absolute power, or if you have a political party that wants absolute power over the population, then the very idea that there is a Lord of Lords and King of Kings beyond your state is a threat. It's dangerous. And so what happens in the story is, we'll talk about this next week, but the brothers try to kill the dreamer because they can't stand the dream. And I think that's the reason behind much church persecution that we see in different parts of the world today. The dream is a threat. The dreamer is a threat. So we'll talk about how the brothers neutralize that threat next week, and we'll look at Genesis 37:12 to 36. And things are going to get very bad for Joseph, as we'll see, before they get better. Okay? So Susan, you said that it reminded you of the prodigal son. So do you want to say more about that, like the family?